In this lecture, I'll be discussing climate change. I'd just like to point out before I get started that there are a number of resources that are available on Bolt that are there to go with this lecture, particularly discussions about perceptions of climate change, including Frontline's Climate of Doubt. There's also a short clip from This American Life, which looks at the education of youth in regards to climate change, and a video on Shishmaref, losing ground on Shishmaref, Alaska. So overall in this lecture, some of the big questions to think about with climate change, much like any environmental issue along the lines of political ecology, how do we know about the issue? Where does knowledge come from regarding the issue of climate change or any issue, social, ecological issue as a whole? How do we know that climate's changing? What are some of the potential impacts of climate change? And then who is going to bear the burden of those impacts? How might they be disproportionately felt by differently situated individuals? We saw some of the same discussion in the context of both overpopulation as well as issues of food security. Well, what can or should be done in order to confront climate change, and who should do it? And this also goes to a discussion of different approaches to environmental issues as a whole. And a lot of this is how the environment is framed in terms of approaches to environment, how sustainability is conceptualized, and then the best way to get there. So that summarizes the big questions with this piece. And what I'd like to go into now is an overview of some of the elements that we'll be talking about. First, we'll start with a real general discussion of the difference between weather and climate. From there, I'll talk about the greenhouse effect. Go into a discussion of greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll look at some of the public opinion on climate change in the United States. This has been measured over the last 20 years with the Gallup polls. We'll look at some of the influences in terms of what actually influences public opinion on climate change, as well as an historic example of opinion on climate change and where climate change comes from, and essentially who is to blame for climate change. Finally, I'll conclude with some ethnographic examples, primarily focused in the Arctic and Alaska, which have been called the front lines of the issue of climate change, or at least one of the front lines with the issue of climate change. So the difference between climate and weather. Climate is weather, essentially, of a place averaged over a period of time, often 30 years. Climate information includes statistical weather information that tells us about the normal weather as well as the range of weather extremes for a given location. On the other hand, weather is the day-to-day state of the atmosphere and its short-term variation in minutes to weeks. People generally think of weather as the combination of temperature, humidity, precipitation, cloudiness, visibility, and wind. We talk about changes in the weather in terms of the near future. How hot is it right now? What will it be like today? Over the weekend? Will we get a snowstorm, a rainstorm? Will it be sunny? And so over the winter of 2013 in mid-latitudes in North America, we saw a pretty dramatic cold season, and it left some to speculate that the winter was the worst that they had seen, and they really needed more of the global warming around to prevent these brutal winters from happening. In a recent study in September of 2014, Beckman and co-authors released an article titled "Weakening of the Stratospheric Polar Vortex by Arctic Sea Ice Loss." And in this article, they make the connection between Arctic sea ice loss and cold winters in the extrapolar regions, and how they're dynamically connected to the polar through the polar stratosphere. Essentially, they argue that decrease in sea ice cover during the early winter months between November and December, especially over the Barents and Kara Seas in Russia, has led to a weakening of the stratospheric polar vortex in midwinter January and February. And you can see there to the right the figures. The one to the left is illustrative of November 14th to the 16th, and this shows the polar vortex in a typical compact configuration. However, we can see this compact configuration break down in January 5th of 2014. These are from NOAA images here, and you can see that the polar vortex is not as compact. You can see the declining temperatures that were felt through the mid-latitudes in much of North America and the Midwest, and even into the northeastern United States as well. Now, many of us have, through initial schooling, come across something to this effect, looking at the division between the greenhouse effect in its so-called natural state and then the human-enhanced greenhouse effect. And we can also make arguments about whether, in fact, this is part of that argument of whether humans are a part of nature or apart from nature. And here you can see a very clear dichotomy. Indeed, the atmosphere even changes colors. This comes from a fairly typical 8th grade classroom education project looking at the enhancement of the greenhouse effect by human interactions with the environment as a whole. And so a lot of these materials for the greenhouse effect and global warming have been developed by individuals interested in bringing science into the classroom and educating both middle and high school students in the United States along the lines of scientific literacy. And that is actually what This American Life, that short audio clip, goes through and talks about a little bit, the difficulties in attempting to convince essentially teenagers about the accuracy of climate change. We can see with the models here are relatively simplistic in relation to all the factors that atmospheric scientists must consider and climatologists as they model climate change into the future and look at the potential detrimental impacts of climate change as a whole. Regarding the question of who's responsible for climate change, we can see that if, as the scientific consensus would argue, with 97 to 98% of scientists having consensus on changing climate, we can see that this is certainly going to have some impact on everyday life. But the question remains, of course, if we consider the greenhouse gas emissions by country as a primary indicator of human-induced climate change or anthropogenic induced climate change, then we also must consider the ramifications of who bears the burden of responsibility of climate change. And if you look at this figure, it's fairly indicative here of a illustration of the responsibility of the United States and China, as well as India, that you can see disproportionately represented on the map, along with much of Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, producing massive quantities of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's particularly evident when you look at, by illustration, to Canada, for example, for the United States. It's also interesting to note that this is total greenhouse gas emissions by a country, but that this does not necessarily align with per capita emissions, as this is 2006 data here, and during that time Qatar was the #1 country for climatic or greenhouse gas emissions per capita. So in the United States, the Gallup polls have been conducted roughly over the last couple of decades on the issues of global warming and climate change. And the statements are fairly interesting, and the responses to them are fairly interesting as well. You could see dips within public opinion regarding climate change. I should point out the Gallup polls are fairly well known for being accurate in regards to overall public opinion of issues. We can see a decline of the interest in global warming from 63% who say that they worry a great deal to a fair amount about global warming. Now, this could be looked at on a Likert scale. A great deal would be a 4, a fair amount would be a 3, only a little would be 2, and or not at all would be a 1. It raises interesting questions about how the data was mixed here in terms of the Gallup poll, and it would be interesting to parse out the information about how many people worry about climate change or global warming a great deal. We could see certain trends of dipping during times of potential economic crises in the United States. You see up at 2008, it's one of those high points on a cycle, going down to 52 and then 51% with the recession around 9/11 as well. 2001, you start to see a trend dipping down overall of concern about climate change as a whole. Gallup polls also asked Americans what their opinion about when the effects of global warming would happen. And many Americans were of the belief that it had already begun, that the effects of global warming were already being witnessed across the globe. Others thought that this might happen at a future time, and those in the minority thought that the climate change or global warming would never happen. The official news reports about global warming, it's also interesting to note here that many Americans feel that these are exaggerated in nature. And you can see that this really starts to be a major trend after 2007, going into 2008, and then through 2009 and 2010. And I think this is, if you look at the film Climate of Doubt, you will see some of the efforts to cast doubt on the work that climatologists were doing, and along with that doubt, into this notion of 97 or 98% scientific consensus on the issue of climate change, you start to see a backpedaling of politicians as their constituents rise up against this notion of policies and laws that would be put into place to mitigate climate change because of the potential ramifications in terms of cost of jobs, increase in cost of living, increase in taxes overall. And again, the Climate of Doubt film is, I think, rather illustrative of this particular time period and actually what's happening within the United States during this time period. The perception of what scientists believe about global warming. You can see that most Americans believe that scientists believe that global warming is occurring. That is a very clear trend from what the data indicate of scientific consensus regarding climate change being at 97 or 98%. Most scientists are unsure. That's been about 28% as of 2013. And then 6% say most believe that it is not occurring. So it's a very small minority of Americans as a whole. The other question that comes into play here is what role do human beings play in the environment as a whole? And what are the impacts of humanity on such a large, on the planet as a whole? Can humans really impact systems, ecological systems across the globe as a whole? And it's interesting here that most Americans do agree with the notion that the primary cause is through human activities. And that's the primary cause of processes and increases in the Earth's temperature over the last century. with about anywhere between, and you can see right there during the 2010 time